This is Morvenn Vahl, Abbess Sanctorum of the Adeptus Sororitas, High Lord of Terra, a sexy new release from Games Workshop. She fucking slaps on the tabletop too. I'm Vince, also known as PleasantKenobi on the internet, and welcome to Warhammer Wednesday, where I talk all things Warhammer as a hobby. This week it's a painting vlog and pseudo tutorial, an open invitation into the inner workings of my thought process of painting this fucking wicked model. Morvenn Vahl is the new Supreme Commander unit, released alongside the latest 9th edition codex for the army, the Sisters of Battle, alongside her Celestian Sacrosands and the other Paragon warsuits, and there's a tank coming as well, the Dogmata, lots of cool new stuff for the Sisters of Battle. She's meant to be a centerpiece character model, so it's worth spending a bit of time on to get a good looking model on the tabletop. On the tabletop, she is reasonably shooty, very fighty, and a force multiplier. What I mean by that is that in spite of her own ability to punch tanks to death, she has some incredible buffs and auras to improve the efficiency of the sisters that you're playing around her. Her targeted buff in the command phase, it makes Robot Golem feel insecure. She's going to be a staple of competitive Angle Sisters lists forevermore. I'm going to go as far as to say that if you're not playing her in your army, and you're trying to be competitive, you're just leaving win percentage on the table. She is fucking nuts. Anyway, let's get to painting. Normally, she has this golden armor look with black robes, according to the box art anyway. But I'm not one for following the box art. I wanted to stand out on the battlefield against the warm off-white tones of my bespoke sisters armor color scheme that I've got here. These are sisters of a custom order that I call the Order of the Faithful Dead. My headcanon is that they do not bury their dead, instead they cremate them, and they use the ash of their fallen sisters, mix it with the paint they use to paint their ceramite, so they carry their dead into battle with them. Little morsel of headcanon there. But because of the off-white bone colour inspired by the Deathwing Terminators of the Dark Angels, I didn't think a gold Morvenn Vahl would be that good, because, well, it'll be that warm tone again. I wanted her to stand out. Morvenn is not part of an order. She is order agnostic, you could say. She's the leader of all sisters, the entire Adeptus Sororitas. She doesn't break your order when you play her in your army, but she isn't actually of the same colour scheme as the rest of your army. Having a red Morvenn Vahl alongside your bloody rose is canonically not quite all that's sensical, really, but to be honest, just do what the fuck you want. If you want a red Morvenn Vahl, just do it. But I'm just saying that's not how it works in canon. So, long story short, I wanted to stand out. Also, I've painted a shitload of Custodes and Golden Boys for my Blood Angels, so I wanted to change. So I went for a darker, colder armor workup. This also, I thought, would make the object source lighting that I wanted to attempt here to glow on her armor better. I don't think if this OSL would have worked so much on a gold, because the oranges and yellows would have been hidden more. We built and primed it with a spray can. I used the Colour Forge black spray they'd sent me for hashtag for free. They sent me some stuff to try out and share with my audience. I wanted to give it a go. The matte black that I normally use to spray stuff when I'm not using my airbrush to prime things is the Halford's black spray, which is around $6.99 for a 300ml can from Halford's. Whilst this can is £9 for a 500ml can, that's from Firestorm Gaming, or $9.50 from Element. So actually, cost efficiency wise, it's kind of close, and I'd say the finish on this is slightly better. It's got a nice matte finish that feels like it will hold paint very well. It's obviously, to compare it to Citadel cans are 400ml, and they're around the £9, £9.50 mark as well. So it's better bang for buck than Citadel, but then what isn't? We're going to start out by airbrushing some base colours and I transition onto the blade. This is my makeshift spraying booth, and this is me in a respirator mask I got from Screwfix. If you're going to be doing airbrushing, even outdoors necessarily, it's probably worth protecting your lungs and your nasal passages from the vapour and particles put into the air by the airbrush. I mean, acrylics aren't poisonous, but you still probably shouldn't breathe them in. Oh, when I'm listening to a podcast here, it's probably Chapter Tactics with a Thursday show from Frontline at this point in time, all available on the Frontline Gaming Network, all available from Spotify. That is not a sponsorship, just like listening to their stuff. We start out with an ever slightly thinned down model Air Aluminium, a colour I believe that Mr. Shy put me onto. Please correct me if I'm wrong there, Stu. Oh, it's absolutely beautiful. We use a little drop of thinner and a squirt of liquid metal. I only mix it in the cup of the airbrush when it's actual airbrush paint, because it's relatively thin to begin with. I never do this for thicker paint anymore, especially just like your normal non-airbrush acrylics, and especially army painter stuff, because that stuff is so thick. It's thick like cum. Save yourself the chore and mix that in a separate pot to avoid clogging your airbrush and just making more work for yourself further down the line. Right, gloves on. And we hit all the armor parts with this wonderful metallic. It's like a dull chrome that almost registers as white on this camera with the lights the way they're set up at the moment. It's that bright. It's a great place to start from. I find it easier bringing metallics down with a wash, whether it be Nuln Oil on this or a Seraphim Sepia style thing on Retributor Gold, because you can bring it down and then come back up with a highlight. I find that easier than starting dark and coming up in tone like you can with other non-metallic colours. I don't really know how I can put this into words or explain it. I guess I don't really get good results trying to glaze metallics and such, so that's just a thing I've noticed. We wash out the brush and we pipette some Nuln Oil into our airbrush and look to knock this armor back a little bit with, well, basically an airbrush applied Nuln Oil to give it more of a grimdark tone. Now, I'm new to airbrushing washes and I'm not sure if I like the outcome here. Instead of being able to manipulate the Nuln Oil with a conventional brush into the nooks and crannies and where we want shadow, it's more acting like a filter, dulling the armor as a whole. Now, the overall outcome was great and I really like it, but I'm just wondering if this is something I'll do again to similar armor workups in the future. Once this was done, I looked at repriming the skirt and the fabric with black, but accidentally went in with gloss as that was right next to my matte black and had to fix that. Fucking whoopsie. Next up, we mask off the handle of the blade to not overspray too much, using blue tack to do so. There are so many different modelling putties you can use, but honestly, blue tack does the job very, very well, and it's very easy to get off afterwards. Simple hobby hack for airbrushing there. Always have blue tack to hand. Before hitting it with any other of these colours, we're going to prime it white, as it's much easier to get bright colours like orange or yellow to take and settle over a white primer than it is a darker primer. We mix up our first colour outside of the cup to ensure that we get a consistency of skimmed milk. That's not just a meme from me, by the way, that is the generally accepted term. You want to have a consistency of skimmed milk before spraying to avoid clogging your airbrush. I hit it with a really icy yellow, too desaturated, so add some yellow ink and hit it again. We remove the blue tack and hit the arm to start creating an effect like the blade is glowing and lighting up the hand. I hit the end of the brush with more white to emulate the bright white seen in extremely hot liquid metals, and then hit the cooler part of the blade towards the hilt, the piece closer to the hand, with a mixture of the previous yellow mixture with some added red ink to get an orange colour. Honestly, I can't be too precise here at what I did, as I'm terrible at doing things off camera, not remembering, and not writing down recipes. I go by feel a lot, and that's probably not what I should do. And I think I could actively do to improve as both a cook and probably a painter too, is to start understanding the recipes that I'm using. What I am using though, that I can tell you, is the Game Ink range from Vallejo, and in this case I was using a little bit of Vallejo Game Air White, because my white ink hadn't showed up yet. That's enough airbrush, let's get there with some normal brushes now. I want to start out with working up the cloth. So in order to do this, I'm going to use an underpainting technique that I learned early on in my Warhammer painting career, if you will, from Tengu Plays Games on Twitter. I saw one of his workups and I asked him what he did and he explained it to me, and I've been using it ever since. We're going to dry brush varying levels of grey onto this black base coat, with each brush getting lighter and lighter in terms of the colouring and less in terms of the coverage. This is with the aim of creating shadow and highlights on the robe. It's basically emulating how light falls on it so that we can overpaint that with a colour that is relatively transparent. If you don't know what dry brushing is, it's where we take paint onto our brush, normally a cheap shitty makeup brush from Boots or Savers or something. Actually not Boots, Savers or Superdrugs or whatever the American equivalent is. You brush off the majority of the paint and the pigment onto a piece of towel nearby, a piece of kitchen towel, and then you go in, just brushing against edges. It's a very good way to catch edges and highlight things that have a lot of texture to them. We start with the super dark grey quite liberally, then less so with the Dawnstone, and then finally with a Rakath Flesh we do minimal highlights. And then the moment of truth. Blood Angel's red contrast paint is super translucent and allows us to utilise the underpainting we just did to create a varied texture to the fabric. Once we have that red on, I crack open a pot of Mephiston red to block out her unique heavy bolter. This is a visual element I want to keep consistent between my entire sister's forces, that their bolt guns and heavy weapons are all red-bodied. This is a classic. Some of the leaders and superiors are going to get purple weapons or purple weapon frames and bodies to signify rank, Whilst that would make a lot of sense for Morvenn Vahl within the colour scheme that I've created, I think the cohesion to tie them all into the same world here is more important. Don't forget, she doesn't share the same colour scheme of armour with the sisters, so having some other elements that are consistent with the other sisters will make the army feel more unified. I paint up her over-shoulder missiles with Avalon Sunset Yellow to give the model some visual contrast to break it up a little. We go in and paint all Purity Seals a dark, rich purple. This allows them to stand out against the other red iconography and elements of the model, like the bolt gun and the robes. A mistake I made with a lot of my Blood Angels, not realising early on that, well, other coloured wax seals may be less realistic, but infinitely more visually interesting, and realism isn't what we aim for a good 60% of the time. Ongoing, my seals on my Blood Angels will also be purples or greens. All paper, bone and ivory plating is painted with Skeleton Horde from Army Painter, my preferred skeleton colour. Honestly, I bought it very early on, I've been using it the whole time. I don't know if I like it more than like Ushabti Bone, because it's so thick. You just need to make sure you water it down before you use it. I decided to make one of her shoulder pads ivory, whilst leaving the other one metal with paper parchment. This ivory pad will be similar to the bone-coloured armour of the rest of the Order of the Faithful Dead. Then we crack out GW's best metallic paint in their range, Retributor Gold, and just hit all of the important insignia to have them stand out from the rest of the armour, something that might have been more of a struggle if we'd done her gold. We hit all of the parchment with Angrek's Earthshade, and we paint her hair a dark grey. Kislev Flesh is the base coat for her face, whilst all ammo casings being fed into her bolt gun are painted with the Rune Lord brass from GW and Citadel. Then we hit the model with a Nuln Oil wash, not the entire model, but we do hit it pretty liberally. We're using quite a thick brush here, I think this is a 3 or a 4, and we push the Nuln Oil around like I mentioned earlier that the airbrush can't do. So we're looking to put it into nooks and crannies. It's going to filter the colour on upper areas, like changing the colour slightly, but the aim, the clear aim is to create depth, texture and shadow in recesses and cracks. Got to get it in those crevasses. Nuln Oil is honestly fantastic for this, and it's probably one of the best things Citadel paints produce. Maybe you hate their bottles. I do too. Maybe you hate some of their core colour line for reasons that I don't really understand. But you aren't allowed to hate Nuln Oil. It's an incredible tool. If you think that washes are cheating, then you're a moron. Next up is a similarly useful favourite of mine, another wash. The washes from Citadel are banging. This is Seraphim Sepia. It's my favourite thing for hitting bone, off-white ivory and golds to give them a warmer tone. It's a sepia tone. So we do this here, bringing her bone-plated shoulder pad to life. Now, whilst the wash is dry, we use Vallejo diorama basing paste to fill in the areas of a base without sculpted detail. This stuff is better value for money and a little bit more subtle than most technical basing paints from Citadel. It also takes paint wonderfully, allowing you to either mix paint into it, but my preferred thing is to allow it to dry and then paint over it so you can have varied basing schemes. I have both this and the sand version, the light yellow one, both of which can be used pretty much identically. You can put them on, they have the same texture, and then you can paint over them. I go in and darken it down with my go-to dark grey that I've mentioned several times already from Vallejo. It's just called dark grey from Vallejo. I know this still doesn't look great, but don't worry. Washes and dry brushing and similar will fix this and give it a much more grounded look a bit later. Whilst that dries, we hit the face with some of the, I think it's Golem flesh contrast. I'll put a bottle of it on screen now. That is very good at creating some deep shadows and complexity in a face with minimal effort. I understand that some people don't like using this because it doesn't really create the details of a face necessarily, but more almost the illusion of it. But I'm super underconfident about faces and eyes in particular, so I rely on this. And whilst not perfect, it does a great job of doing what I need it to do. It's a part that I have not honed or even remotely mastered. Later on, we use a bit of Bugman's Glow to add some shade to the cheeks and Kislev Flesh to improve highlights. We then just go in and finish off some of the controls of the suit with Vallejo's dark grey again to add some variety and detailing to the armour and break up the sea of dark silver that we have going on here. Same for a load of pipes and cables at the back to just add some detail to the model, but without distracting from the rest of it. A couple of ivory details brought out with bone from Army Painter again, using a lot of the same paints throughout the process. Whilst that's not the best for creating contrast across the model, it does create a more cohesive whole that feels like it exists within its own world, especially when using those paints again across the rest of your army. I block out some mist parchment that I basically just missed earlier, and then proceed to highlight the seals with a nice, vibrant, light pink. A little bit of McCrag blue here for the lenses of the bolter. It's weird, this bottle's got optics, it's got like a lens and stuff, like a scope. I don't understand how a gun arm, why it would have a scope. Maybe it's a camera, who knows. I use Skeleton Horde contrast paint to hit the metallic structure she stood atop to give it a grungy filter of sorts. I wonder if I should have gone darker with maybe perhaps snakebite leather. It's an attempt to make it dirty without completely hiding the metallic beneath. Dry brushing will pull it all together later. And then next up we highlight her hair with some Dawnstone, and then highlight the bolter with some Wazdaka red. The highlight was a little too subtle here looking at the model once it's finished. I think we should have gone in with maybe Wild Rider red or similar. I think I probably meant to, but the bottles look very similar when I'm in not a rush, but when I'm not taking all the time in the world. I then use that same red, the Wazdaka, to highlight or add extra highlights to the fabric upon her legs. We add a bit more Anglic's Earthshade to areas to dirty them up, so like the shadows of some of the fabric, if there were some, not really many on here, and like underarm and on the cables and stuff. We're now on to one of my favourite bits, the edge highlighting the armour to make it pop. Now, edge highlighting a whole squad can be annoying, but edge highlighting a vehicle or edge highlighting a character, I'm into it. I go in with Stormhost Silver to highlight anywhere where the sunlight would catch on the armour. Upper edges, sharp corners and similar. The idea is to make the model pop by having the highlights contrast with the depth provided by the washes earlier. I don't know a huge amount about colour theory, but basically your mid-tone is the middle of these things, and you have a highlight, and you have below the mid-tone, like the shadow or the shade, I guess. The highlight allows that mid-tone to sit between the two and give the whole model texture that makes it feel like it's come to life. It gives it a gradient, I guess. A texture. I use the word texture a lot in this video. This is probably the most labour-intensive and longest part of the process when painting armour, but honestly it's one of the most rewarding. As you do it, it really, and I cannot stress this enough, brings the model to life. You might be painting a model and think it looks shit, and then the moment you start hitting those edge highlights, where you get your brush, you get it nice and thin, you put a little bit of paint on that, not too much, make sure it's wet as well, and then you just rub the edge along sharp edges, and it just absolutely can transform a paint job. We'll do the same to all the parchment, highlighting with the base colour to juxtapose bits with the darkened shadows caused by the washes earlier. Now my second favourite bit is dry brushing bases. Similar to the cloth earlier, we're going in with two varied levels of grey, and I might hit it with a third super light highlight. I just can't remember as I'm writing this bit down whether I did. But this is not to create a light map like we did on the fabric to paint over the contrast paint. Instead, this is to create the desired dirty and very dusty ground effect. We begin with Dawnstone here, and then afterwards rack off the flesh as our lighter grey, and it's just a nice and simple way to create texture. Again, remember, if you're going to be dry brushing, you don't want to use your good brushes, you don't need an expensive brush from Citadel. A cheap, dirt cheap, shitty makeup brush from some sort of selection from Savers is perfect. That's what all of mine are. They're all like £1 or £2 makeup brushes from Savers and places like that. So I did notice as I dry brush here, I'm shaking the camera violently as it's anchored to the desk. Professional. I also dry brush some Riser Rust onto the metal underfoot in order to give it an eroded, slightly worn, slightly rusted feel. And then, completely off camera, like an absolute moron, I highlight all the bullet shells on the base with brass, and then on camera, I highlight the skulls with the super light grey. Only a touch of highlight is needed for each of these, as these elements, if you think about it, they would be buried in the dirt beneath her feet anyway, so you don't have to go out of your way to ensure that you get super accurate, strong coverage of each bullet shell with the metal here. It's just not necessary. Allow them to be part of the base. Allow them to have highlights to make them noticeable, but bear in mind they're just not the focus of the model. Going in with Kiss Their Flesh to highlight the face again, as I'm unhappy with how it looked earlier. I think I actually missed the bit where we highlighted it earlier. This gives her face some texture and some character. Again, I use the word texture. Jesus, I expand my vocabulary. I highlight each of her rockets with an icy yellow from Vallejo, something that looks stark at first, but will really just add an overall level of detail to the model, a good level of detail. And that marked the end of my brushwork on the model. Now to possibly completely fuck up this 3-hour paint job by adding a warm glow beneath her burning blade. So after talking through some options with Stu, also known as That Mr. Shy, a member of my Discord, I'm a member of his Discord. He's a great painting channel if you want to learn more about painting miniatures outside of just Warhammer miniatures too. I decided to try an effect with yellow, white and red inks under his suggestion. After going back and forth on differing mixtures of yellow ink, white ink and red ink, I think I roughly knew what I wanted. I started to test it out on these testers I have, these cultists that just sit on my air booth and take paint when I need to try something out. I was adding small amounts at a time and doing it with inks as it gives a transparency that normal paints don't, which means it will look more like a light filter over details beneath instead of just obscuring them with a blanket of yellow. Honestly, maybe it's a little bit too subtle on her leg, but we'll come to more of that in a moment. This filming angle also sucks. I will get better at this one day, I promise. So I finally start hitting Morvenn with a yellow, which actually looks great. This would be a great effect for underneath a street lamp or similar. I believe this was 2 parts yellow ink to 1 part white. We then add 1 drop of white again and 2 drops of red to simulate an orange tone like I had on the blade earlier. I felt that the orange was slightly too red compared to the blade, so I added 1 more drop of yellow. We hit the base and the foot, and it looked good to me, so I decided to get a little bit ambitious and hit one side of Morvenn with it to create an orange glow across that entire side of her body, basically creating, well, emulating the idea or simulating the idea that the blade is glowing and lighting up her body. And it came out looking pretty good. I'm super happy with how she came out, especially for this being my first object sourced lighting attempt with an airbrush. Maybe I should have tried it on a non-centerpiece character first that I hadn't spent 3 hours painting. Who knows? I feel like I have a great looking mini at the end of it and learned some stuff along the way. No oil through the airbrush wasn't what I wanted, and if I were to go back and do it again, I would add a little bit more of a red element to the blade, I think, and I would have worked up the arm with inks instead of paints, probably using reference images a little bit more as well, and trying to perhaps glaze some yellow on the edges to emulate the cooling of the metal towards the outer edges of the blade. But ultimately, I'm still happy. It still has a good look to it. It doesn't have to look super realistic. It took me just over 3 hours. I think I come to the 3 hour and 30 minutes of footage mark, and I'm pretty happy with it. Regardless of how I feel though, I would love to hear what you think of the model, the paint scheme, the approach, and this video. Do you enjoy this chilled out, like Bob Ross, sit down, chill with me while I paint this model that I'm really excited to paint, and sort of talking through my process as I go? It's not a tutorial as such, it's kind of like a vlog. I hope people are learning some stuff from it and finding it interesting. Please let me know in the comment section below. I'm going to do another one of these next week, and I'm going to be painting this. This is Omnath from WizKids. It's not out yet. So yeah, that's next week's version of this. Anyway, if you enjoyed the video, hit that like button, smash that bell, and don't forget to subscribe. I've been Vince, also known as PleasantKenobi, and I'll see you all soon. Ta-ta for now.